In July of 1977, Dr. Jose Chua was at home with his wife Remy. After dinner, she had made comments that she wasn't feeling the best and needed a wee lie down, which she did. A short time later, Dr. Chua would hear a noise coming from their bedroom that sounded like his wife was moaning in her sleep. When he went to investigate, his wife was now sitting upright, and when he asked her if she was okay, she would answer him. Only it wasn't his wife's voice. This wasn't the only time this would happen. After listening to what the strange voice had to say, Dr. Chua would ultimately decide to call the police. These events and what would follow not only affected the Chua family for the rest of their lives, but it would become the most controversial evidence ever presented in court for a real-life murder investigation. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. If you enjoy my content and fancy seeing more, then make sure you subscribe. If you have a fear of commitment, then don't. I'll understand. We can still be friends. Let's jump right into the remarkable story of Teresita Basa and how she solved her own murder. At 3 p.m. on the 21st of February 1977, Teresita Basa would be finishing her shift at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, where she worked as a respiratory specialist. The 47-year-old was a native of the Philippines. She was an only child to a reasonably well-off set of parents. She had graduated from Assumption College in Manila before moving to the United States, where she would earn her master's degree in music at Indiana University. It's freezing cold in Chicago in February, and it would start getting dark around 5 p.m. Not to worry though, because it would only take around 25 minutes for Teresita to get home. She lived in a 4-room apartment in the Park West area of Chicago. Although she had been living in the United States for the last 15 years, she was still surprised at how different Chicago was compared to her hometown of Dumaguete on Negros Island in the south of the Philippines. Around this time of year, her hometown would be warm and the landscape would be lush and green. This is in stark contrast to the towering buildings and freezing temperatures of a Chicago winter. She loved her job at the hospital. She enjoyed dealing with the patients and assisting doctors in formulating treatment plans that focused on her speciality. As a respiratory specialist, she would often be dealing with those patients that had poor lung function and issues with their breathing. Her colleagues would later say that she was simply lovely, always smiling and friendly. She was unassuming and never had a bad word to say about anyone or anything. They would also say that Teresita would be the last person any of them would imagine falling victim to a violent crime. Growing up in the Philippines in the 1930s and the 40s, it was rare for women to progress into academia. From a very early age, Teresita was obsessed with music and decided early on that she wanted to become a concert pianist. As a kid, she would beg her parents for a piano so that she could learn and essentially master that instrument. It wasn't until she was midway through her music career at Indiana University that she changed her focus from becoming a pianist, and instead a new dream would take shape. She wanted to become a music teacher. Although she loved her current job, it was really just a means to an end. It helped her pay her bills and her rent whilst she progressed towards eventually becoming a music teacher. A dream that was almost within her grasp. As she sat on the bus going home, she would look down at her hands. She was thinking about her piano that was awaiting her back at her apartment. She also looked upon the beautiful pearl ring that her mother had gifted her the last time that she visited Teresita in Chicago. It was somewhat of a family heirloom. It was given to her mother from her father. Teresita's father was a renowned judge and had picked up the ring during a trip to France. Prior to her mother saying her goodbyes and returning to the Philippines, she would present Teresita with the gift of the ring, as well as a few other family heirlooms in the form of a jade pendant and a few other items of jewellery, before reminding her that her family loves and misses her back home. She thought about the night ahead. What would she have for dinner? She would definitely get in some piano practice and then maybe watch some TV. Although recently her TV was playing up, and as the bus trundled to her stop, she silently agreed with herself that she would need someone with technical knowledge to have a wee look at the TV in the hopes of getting it fixed. Teresita made her way to the lobby of her apartment building. As she entered the elevator and pressed the button for the 15th floor, she would be thankful that she didn't have to take the stairs. A brief elevator ride later, and she would be at her apartment, which was 15B. At around 8 p.m, she heard a knock from her apartment door. As she walked towards the door, she would ask who was there. Upon hearing the answer through the door, she would happily unlock it and invite her guest inside. An hour later, around 9 p.m, the residents of 2740 North Pine Grove Avenue were all standing out in the winter air as the first fire engine arrived. Looking up at the apartment complex, flames and smoke could be seen billowing from a window on the 15th floor. 20 minutes earlier, a 911 call was placed to the fire department, as residents had seen and could smell smoke coming from 15B. With the assistance of the building maintenance man, the fire department swiftly gained entry to the apartment. Once inside, they were able to extinguish the source of the fire, which seemed to be an overturned mattress on the floor of the main bedroom. Nearby would be a burning pile of clothes. The lieutenant of the fire department entered the bedroom, followed by 2 uniformed police officers, in an attempt to ascertain the cause of the fire. One of the first things the lieutenant did was to flip over the smouldering mattress. What they discovered underneath would cause him and the 2 cops to turn away as they backed out into the hallway, where one of the police officers would radio dispatch for medical assistance and the homicide unit. Apartment 15B was now a murder scene. Chicago detective Joe Stachula and his partner Lee Eppin were assigned to this case. Upon their arrival at apartment 15B, the first thing they noticed was the mess. Almost all of the drawers had been pulled out, some of them were emptied out onto the floor, and several items of furniture in the living room were overturned. Then they entered the bedroom. Laying on the floor was the charred, naked body of Teresita. Although the detectives were briefed prior to arrival, they were still jarred by what they were looking at. The 47-year-old was laying on her back, and although she had sustained significant burns due to the fire, the thing that caught the detectives' attention was the large kitchen knife protruding from the centre of her chest. It was driven so deep that the entirety of the blade had entered her chest cavity, leaving only the handle showing. The detectives quickly got to work, piecing together the final moments of Teresita's life. It was determined that she may well have known her attacker, as there were no signs of forced entry. It appeared that due to her being naked that she was sexually assaulted, and the perpetrator then ransacked the apartment, scouring for anything of value before setting the fire in an attempt to conceal any evidence. However, yet another surprise awaited detectives when the autopsy report came back. The motive was not sexual, as not only was Teresita not sexually assaulted, but she was in fact still a virgin. This meant one thing: the entire scene had been staged. So now detectives had more work on their hands. In light of the autopsy report, the killer could just as easily have been a female as opposed to a male. Also, there was no way of knowing which, if any, items were stolen from the property. As Teresita lived alone, she would be the only one that would be able to say for sure what was missing. Investigators would hit dead end after dead end. Firstly, although the fire was contained to the bedroom, it was burnt enough to have destroyed any trace evidence or fingerprints from the knife. After interviewing all of her friends and co-workers, the cops learned that besides the occasional date, she didn't have a boyfriend. By the end of April that year, 6 weeks had passed since Teresita's murder, and detectives were no further forward in terms of leads than they were when they first started. Well, that's not entirely true, because they did have 2 possible leads. One of these leads was a telephone call that Teresita had received on the night of the murder. Ruth Loeb was a friend of Teresita's, and she called her around 7:30 p.m. that night. That call lasted around 30 minutes, during which Teresita would mention that she was expecting a visitor that night. Ruth would later tell detectives that towards the end of the call, she actually heard a male voice before they said their goodbyes and the call was ended. Teresita never mentioned to Ruth exactly who the visitor was, and Ruth would later say that she didn't recognise the voice that she heard. But at least now the detectives knew their person of interest was male. The second lead that the detectives had was a wee note that Teresita had written. This note simply said, "Get tickets for AS." After speaking to numerous people in Teresita's life, from her neighbours to her friends and several colleagues, The detectives had not come across or heard mention of anyone that could potentially be AS. More dead ends. It would appear that several months later, the gruesome murder of Teresita Basa would be destined to become an unsolved case. I can only imagine how frustrating this must be for any detective investigating a case like this. However, pretty soon detectives would get another lead. Something downright bizarre, unusual and disturbing was about to crack this case wide open. Not long after Teresita's murder, one of her colleagues in the respiratory department would start to behave strangely. Remy Chua was 38 years old, and like I said, she worked alongside Teresita in the same department at Edgewater Hospital. Remy was also a native of the Philippines, but although they were working in the same department, they worked opposite shifts, so they never really knew each other that well. Remy's colleagues would later say that her behaviour changed after the murder. She started using Teresita's locker at work. She was even heard humming a very particular tune, a tune which Teresita was known to hum whilst working and having lunch. But it didn't stop there. Remy began to imitate Teresita. She even developed an interest in music just like Teresita. She would sit at the same table in the cafeteria that Teresita almost exclusively sat at. This was disturbing behaviour to witness. She was approached by several of her colleagues, basically asking her what was going on and why she was impersonating a fellow colleague that was brutally murdered. Remy would wave them off and tell them to mind their own business. It became so bizarre and unsettling that a few of her co-workers went to speak to their supervisor to relay the behaviour of Remy. The supervisor would confront Remy about this, only to be met with more hostility. In fact, her reaction was so dramatic and over the top that she was subsequently fired from her job at the hospital. Dr. Jose Chua was married to Remy. He was a surgeon also in Chicago, but at a different hospital. His wife would return home from being fired at work and would be visibly upset and shaken. He would sit her down at the kitchen table and plead with her to tell him what was wrong. She would tell her husband a diluted version of events. Rather than telling him the truth that she had just been fired and the reasons why, she would tell him that she was effectively made redundant and therefore was out of work. She neglected to mention that she was imitating a deceased co-worker. In fact, up until this point, Dr. Chua had never heard the name Teresita Basa before, and he certainly wasn't aware of her murder. So it came as a shock when Remy would stand up and announce that she wasn't feeling well and was going to lie down for a while, and in a few moments Dr. Chua and his wife were about to be drawn into one of the most bizarre and unlikely murder investigations in America's history. Remy's mother was at the house that day visiting the couple. As Remy walked past her on the way to the bedroom, her mother would signal to Jose to follow his wife as she did not look good. Jose would enter the bedroom and see Remy laying on top of the bed staring blankly up at the ceiling. He was clearly worried about his wife. This was so out of character for her. He sat next to her and pleaded with her to speak to him, just to tell him what's wrong. An answer would come, but it was not his wife's voice. He would later say that he did not recognise the strange voice coming from his wife. In fact, it wasn't even in English. She was speaking Tagalog, which is a native language spoken in the Philippines, a language that both of the Chuas knew but never used. The voice simply said, "Doctor, you must help me." Jose Chua would later say that not only was the voice strange and in Tagalog, but that it had a particular Spanish accent to it, an accent which his wife certainly never had. He asked a simple question: "What is your name?" Of course he was expecting his wife to answer with Remy. Instead, however, the answer came forth still in this strange Tagalog voice. "My name is Teresita Basa." Dr. Chua said that he didn't know anyone by that name. However, his wife fell silent. He went on to ask, "What do you want?" Right away, the voice answered that she was murdered and that she wanted to reveal the name of her killer. Dr. Chua was completely dumbfounded. This was way outside of his comfort zone as a medical professional. He instinctively tried to reassure Remy and get her to snap out of this. However, as he gently shook his wife, the strange voice only became more insistent. The voice would give Dr. Chua very specific details of the murder and then went on to name her killer. She told the doctor that her killer arrived at her apartment on the night of Monday, February 21st at around 8 p.m. She went on to say that she let him in because he was her friend. She then said that not long after letting him in, he choked her from behind and stabbed her in the chest with a kitchen knife. After everything was said and done, Remy would be in this trance state for around 30 minutes. After the voice said what it had to say, Remy snapped out of the trance as if she had just woken up from a nap. She was confused to find her husband sitting next to her with a look of shock on his face, and her mother was standing looking just as pale and frightened. She asked her husband what was going on. Dr. Chua calmly asked his wife if she remembered anything of what just took place, to which she replied, no. The last thing she remembers was sitting in the next room. She doesn't even know how she got to the bed. Obviously, her husband was confused and scared, but still he took a deep breath and went on to explain exactly what just took place. Jose would ask his wife if she knew someone called Teresita Basa. His wife would tell him that, yeah, she did, that she was a woman that worked at Edgewater and was murdered some time ago. Remy would go on to tell her husband that she barely knew Teresita. At best, they were acquaintances. As she was telling her husband this, she suddenly remembered something that happened to her 2 weeks earlier that might be starting to make sense. About 2 weeks earlier, she was in the break room at the hospital. It had been a long shift and she wanted a wee nap during her break. She said that when she was lying down and had closed her eyes, that she had this overwhelming sense that someone else was in there with her. She felt a presence in the room with her. She assumed that one of her colleagues had entered the room, and so she opened her eyes. There, standing in the room, was Teresita Basa, staring right back at her. She had put this incident down to stress and tiredness, and never mentioned it to anyone, because, well, she was embarrassed. And besides, she's not going to go around the hospital telling folk that she'd just seen the ghost of a dead colleague. That's just not cool. Dr. Chua would reassure his wife and tell her that surely this just must have been some sort of dream. Like she said, she was tired and had a busy shift. Internally, the man was scared. What was going on? He asked his wife if she recognised the name of Teresita's killer. The voice had repeated the killer's name several times. Remy would tell her husband that she did recognise the name. But what now? Surely they couldn't go to the police. They would look mental. At best, they would be deemed insane. At worst, they would become suspects. After all, they now had key information about an ongoing murder case from the deceased victim. They were far too scared to go to the police, so they tried to get on with their lives. However, this would only be good for a few days, when Teresita would speak again. One afternoon, Remy was on the telephone, standing next to where her husband was sitting. She suddenly dropped the receiver, and when Jose looked up, she appeared to be in some sort of trance again. Then the voice came back. Teresita would go on to plead with the Chuas to help her. She insisted that they go to the police with the information that she had given them. The murderer cannot get away with this. Dr. Chua would later say that the voice was really insistent. Once Remy snapped out of this second trance, again they refused to go to the police. Even though they were starting to believe the possibility that Teresita was contacting them from the grave and that the information she had given them could very well be true, Dr. Chua's fear was that they simply had no solid evidence other than a spirit communicating through Remy. They would be committed to the loony bin for sure, not to mention Dr. Chua's reputation would be tarnished. A few days later, Remy would fall into yet another trance. The Chuas were asleep in bed this time. Remy suddenly opened her eyes and started speaking loudly in the voice of Teresita. She was speaking in Tagalog again with the Spanish inflection. This time, Dr. Chua had enough. He sat up in bed and speaking directly to Teresita, he demanded solid proof before they would go to the police. You should be careful what you wish for, because proof is what they got. She would go on to say that after the perpetrator entered her apartment and stabbed her, he rifled through the drawers and took several items of specific jewellery that had been given to Teresita by her mother. He had taken a pearl cocktail ring and a jade necklace, which she said he then gave to his girlfriend that he lived with. Now, historically, any type of supposed contact with the dead, whether it be psychic phenomena or a seance, any information usually provided by this supposed spirit is usually fairly vague and open to interpretation, but in this case, man, it was really specific. The voice went on in startling detail. Not only did she provide the names of her killer and his girlfriend, but she even went on to give names and telephone numbers of Teresita's relatives that lived in the Chicago area that would be able to identify this jewellery. So now the Chuas had the evidence that they desired, or at least had enough now to speak to the police. They contacted the local police department in Evanston to relay all the information that they had, albeit they didn't tell them right away that they received this information from the dead spirit of Teresita. They told police that Remy had received a threatening telephone call from the person that Teresita identified as her killer. Apparently, he had called the Chua residence to say, "You're next." It's unknown at this point though, if this actually happened, or if it was just a story that the Chuas concocted to at least get the detectives to pay attention to the name that they were given. In August of 1977, so 5 months after the murder, Detective Stachula would get the phone call from Evanston police, basically relaying all the information that the Chuas had told them. When the detective heard the name of the suspect, he felt a cold chill running down his spine. A few days later, Detective Stachula would find himself in the Chua's home, sitting opposite to a well-educated professional couple that had some outrageous claims to make. Dr. Chua would relay the entire story of Remy channeling Teresita, how the strange voice provided them with very specific details and even the name of the killer, Alan Showery. When the detective first heard this name, Alan Showery, over the phone from the police up in Evanston, a chill ran down the back of his spine because he instantly made the connection as the initials AS. When asked if they knew Alan Showery, Remy would go on to tell the detective that he was in fact a technician at Edgewater Hospital where she and Teresita worked. Detective Stachula was completely overwhelmed and at a loss with what to do with this information. He immediately ruled out the Chua's involvement in the murder, as they had rock-solid alibis. After returning to the precinct, he would run Showery's name through the databases, and it would appear that he had a lengthy rap sheet. He had been arrested previously for burglary, theft and sexual assault, yet was never convicted. After re-interviewing Teresita's colleagues, they confirmed that Showery and Teresita were friends, and they discovered that he may well have went to her apartment that night to fix her broken down TV. If this was true, then that would place him at the scene on the night in question. On the afternoon of August 11th, 1977, Detective Stachula and Eppin arrived at the home of Alan Showery and his girlfriend. Showery was escorted to the waiting police vehicle and taken to the police station for a wee chat. Showery would tell the cops at first that he hadn't been to Teresita's apartment and that he hadn't actually hung out with her for months prior to the murder. The detectives bluffed and said that they found his prints in and around the apartment. At this point, Showery suddenly remembered that he was in fact at her apartment on the night of the murder. It was to fix her TV, but he left around 6:30 p.m. because he didn't have the right tools for the job. Detectives left Showery at the station while they went back to speak to his girlfriend to see if she could corroborate his movements that night. As they were speaking to her, Detective Stachula noticed something that would break this case wide open. She was wearing a very distinctive pearl cocktail ring. When asked about the ring, she openly said that, the ring as well as a few other items of jewellery were given to her as a belated Christmas gift from Alan in late February of that year, a short time after Teresita was murdered. Detectives used the telephone numbers provided by the Chuas for Teresita's relatives and asked them to attend the police office. One of Teresita's cousins immediately identified the ring and the jade necklace as being those that were gifted to Teresita by her mother. When confronted with this new evidence, Alan Showery confessed to the murder of Teresita Basa. The next morning, detectives had a 13-page signed confession. On the night that Teresita was murdered, Showery arrived at her apartment at around 6:30 p.m. to fix her TV. After realising that he didn't have the tools, he left her apartment at 7:30. He told her that he would return another time when he had the right tools, but he returned to her apartment and knocked on the door at 8 p.m. Once she let him in, he wrapped his arm around her neck from behind and dragged her into the bedroom. He choked her until she lost consciousness. He lay her on her back and stripped her of all her clothes. He positioned her body to make it look like she had been sexually assaulted. He went to the kitchen and got a large kitchen knife. Returning to the room, he plunged the knife deep into her chest. He then ransacked the wee flat and only found $30 in cash and some jewellery. Before leaving the apartment, he tipped over the mattress on top of Teresita and set it on fire, as well as her clothing, which were piled beside her. 17 months after Teresita was killed, so on February the 27th of January in 1979, the judge that was presiding over the Alan Showery murder trial declared a mistrial in this case. This was because the jury were deadlocked and unable to reach a verdict unanimously. Despite having overwhelming evidence and an extensive written confession, the defence team would poke several holes in the way that this information was garnered from the supposed ghost of Teresita. Under advice from his counsel, Showery recanted his entire confession. 3 weeks later though, so on the 22nd of February, Showery would shock everyone, his defence team and the media, by changing his story yet again. This time, he fully admitted to killing Teresita. He was sentenced to only 14 years for her murder. However, after exhibiting good behaviour, he was released in 1983 after serving only 4 years. To this day, his whereabouts are unknown. So I've got my own personal thoughts about this case. I've got no doubts that Showery did it, for sure, but I'm a wee bit sceptical about the whole Remy Chua channeling a spirit sort of thing. I feel that somehow she got wind of the crime, or maybe she overheard something and then she fabricated the story, either for attention or a way to direct the cops. But then, they could have come up with a less fantastical story. In fact, they could have just stuck with the whole offending phone call threat story and left out all of the spooky ghost stuff. All I will say is this: in 1979, the Chuas published a best-selling book about the entire ordeal. That's all I'm saying. And then I think there was a movie made and all that. The thing is, there were so many ways that they could have just directed the cops right to Showery. And I'm sure an anonymous tip would have led detectives to the evidence and subsequent confession, and then maybe, just maybe, they could have gotten a life sentence out of this guy. Because, as I've always said, a life for a life. Well, that's it for this story, folks. I hope wherever you are in the world that you're doing alright. Stay safe and keep smiling.